Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Dev Prod Eng Lowdown. We're super excited about this one today. We got Lee Mills from Spotify Backstage. We got Baruch from the Gradle team and myself. So why are we here? What is Dev Prod Eng Lowdown, DPE Lowdown? We started these webcast series to bring more attention and share with the community what cool things about developer productivity engineering folks are doing around the world, right? And I learned about Spotify Backstage a few years ago. We were very close with Spotify folks, right? We helped them a lot with their builds and develop productivity, and they're very knowledgeable, right? One of the top teams with massive investment in develop productivity engineering. And we got a taste of this thing called Backstage. We didn't know much about it until I started reading more and more about it, how certain companies are adopting it and whatnot. And we internally had a meeting with Francesco, who was on the Backstage DevRel team. And we have Backstage integration on the Gradle Enterprise roadmap for the Gradle Enterprise customers watching this. It's coming. It's definitely coming. And I reached out and I got introduced to Lee, and here he is today. And Lee, give a quick intro about what you work on today.
Yeah, sure. So, firstly, thanks for having me. It's great to be out and just talking about Backstage and sharing a little bit about it and everything. As for myself, Spotify, obviously, I've been there for about 4 years, and that whole time I've been focused on Backstage. Particularly, I am our community lead. I'm our open source lead. I work with a couple of teams there, specifically on, work with the maintainers and with specifically the software catalog, and trying to get that driven out a little bit. Backstage itself, there's 50 to 60 people there now, focused around that, and we are part of what's called Platform Developer Experience, which you'll have to forgive me, I don't actually know the number. It's got to be well over 100 folks that are focused all around developer experience and developer productivity at Spotify, and obviously in the open source with Backstage.
Awesome. Quick run through for the agenda today, right? We're just going to talk about how Backstage started. Lee mentioned, they have 50, 60 people on it, right? And it's also open source. That, how Spotify kind of sponsored doing such an effort like this, right, for a music company. And then we're going to talk about some of the wins, some metrics, some numbers. How did this all work out? How do you, any investment in develop productivity engineering, certain folks need to see some data, business justification, as we call it, right? And then we'll get a demo from Lee and talk about who's using it in the community and some of the wins there, right? Lee, first off, and I know we're going to go deep into this with the demo, but give us a short kind of overview of Backstage, and then we'll get into how it kind of started.
Yeah, for sure. So Backstage is our open source developer platform. It is effectively a single pane of glass that pulls together information, data, all of your different services that you might be using in a day-to-day in a engineering organization. We're focused around a few specific use cases at the core. So that is create, manage, and explore. So we allow you to, or we provide tooling that enables you to create services, create components and systems in a really simple way, in like using cookie cutter templates. We provide a software catalog that's like an inventory service that kind of ties everything together. It gives you all of your services, all of the associated metadata, and effectively pulls the whole system together. And then from the Explore aspect, it's all around kind of discoverability. It's finding the right information at the right time. It's piecing your journey. So it's not just about, I need to use tool A and tool B. It's about how do we connect that together in your journey that you're trying to achieve. So that's kind of backstage at a 1,000-mile high kind of view. It's based around a plugin model, I suppose, is the other thing to mention. So I think one of the most important things is the ownership model that we use, which Backstage can do a lot of different things. We have internally over 200 plugins, we call them. Effectively, a plugin is a place where you can teams can build out a specific piece of functionality. So we have, for example, CI/CD plugins, we have Kubernetes plugins, and various other ones. And the ownership model around that is we have a really big team focused on Backstage, but that's focused on developing the platform and developing specific plugins all around the open source. The actual team that looks after Backstage at Spotify is actually only 5 engineers. And the reason we can do that is if we took the Kubernetes plugin as an example, that is owned by the team who owns Kubernetes for Spotify. So it's kind of like the experts own that domain. And where the Backstage engineers come in is how do we piece that together in that journey? If you're creating a piece of software, how do we go from creating the service, the infrastructure, all of the Kubernetes pieces, connecting it to CI/CD, and that's what the Backstage team does. But we effectively empower the rest of the org to own all of those different bits. So that's it. A little bit rambly, but a very high level.
No, that was perfect. How did all this start at Spotify? What's you told me this story before, and it was very interesting, right?
Yeah. It started with a specific problem. Effectively, well, there was two. The specific issue at the time when Backstage started, Spotify was going through hypergrowth. We were bringing in a lot of people. We were bringing in a lot of new engineers, a lot of new teams, and Spotify works to kind of a set of principles. We want to make sure that our teams are autonomous. We want to empower those teams to be able to make decisions and craft things and kind of drive their own roadmap forward. And in kind of enabling all of this, we want to maintain that speed. The challenge is when you do this, one example I always go to is, for example, like authentication. We had teams that needed to make use of authentication. So they spool up an authentication service, they get running with it. And at some point we had an authentication service for just general services. We had an authentication services for HR. We had authentication services for security. And of course, we have the whole authentication service that you use on a Tuesday afternoon if you're standing on one leg. You end up with duplication as the number of services grow. So Backstage really started out with, we have this problem. We want teams to continue to be autonomous and empowered. We want to continue operating at speed. How can we help them? So the first problem was actually that of just an inventory problem. It was, we are growing in the number of services, we're growing in the number of engineers. Can we just effectively at the beginning make a list of every service that we've got, make a list of who owns that service? So as you're kind of thinking, right, we need to move fast, we need an authentication service, you can go and look at this list and say, right, there's already an authentication service, there's a person I can reach out to, and we can use that rather than creating new. And that was kind of the nexus point, if you will. And what happened from there was effectively, as we went around and started to onboard teams and get them to kind of share this data, what we found were teams started to add tools that supported those services to this list. So you then started to expose, if it's an auth service, there's 4 different tools that help you get integrated or get started or modify things, etc. And it started to spread out in this kind of tree. So what we started to notice was we needed to start to build something around this to kind of expose it in a sensible way and allow people to interact with all of these different tools. Fast forward to today, tools are now what we call plugins. But it all started from, as I say, from inventory, and then kind of it expanded from there. Yeah, there's more to it, but we can dive into that.
Yeah. And I think we got some questions, Baruch. Any good ones we could take?
Yeah, we got our first question, and I wanted to take this opportunity to ask people to ask more. The first question is, so is Backstage is the only thing at Spotify for internal developer platforms, or are you running it alongside with other web platforms to produce a comprehensive developer experience?
Wow, good question. So Backstage is by far and large the biggest platform that we have internally at Spotify, but it's not the only platform. The power of Backstage is it surfaces relevant information at the time, but it doesn't have to surface everything. So there are plenty of other tools, and my mind goes blank as I'm saying this, of course. But there's plenty of other tools and services and SaaS platforms that we use, and all we use Backstage for is effectively surfacing them at a high level, and then basically linking out to them if you want the full detail and dive deep into them. So there are many tools, but when we're thinking about bringing a new tool on, we genuinely start from the point of what is it we're trying to achieve, and we already have this like gateway, we already have this entryway. Should it be part of that, part of Backstage, or is it something separate?
That's very reasonable and developer friendly, I would say. Another question that would be, I'll generalize a little bit the question that has been asked. Speaking about plugins, people have different things in mind when they think about plugins. Everything from like Jira plugins to everything. What is Backstage definition of plugin?
What a good question. If only I had a good answer for that. So when we're thinking about plugin, effectively with Backstage, you can make a plugin for anything. When you actually run the tooling, it's a single command you run in a terminal, and it will create you a base plugin with an example setup. But effectively, all a plugin is a blank canvas surrounded by this frame, if you will, that is Backstage. It has access to a number of APIs within Backstage to connect it up to various different things. So, for example, when you create a new service in Backstage, it will automatically connect it up to your CI/CD. It will connect it up to your testing. It'll connect it up across the platform. Typically, when it comes to creating a plugin, so the way we manage it at Spotify is it's all done through GitHub code owners for us. But a team will say, right, we've got an idea for a plugin. We want to create this plugin. They submit a PR. That's the only point where the Backstage team has like I don't want to say purview, but they approve that PR. And generally all we do is think about the theme. If Backstage for Spotify is very much focused on engineering teams, developer teams, and productivity. So, for example, if someone came and said, right, we're going to create a plugin based around finance, maybe we want to have a conversation of does that take the platform in a new direction? But generally, I mean, as I say, at Spotify, we've got 200 and something plugins now. And that's everything from things like Jenkins, Circle CI, Kubernetes, documentation-based plugins, Lighthouse. The only real kind of differences when you get into the technicality of it is how they are backed. Sometimes they back off to a third-party system elsewhere via a proxy. Sometimes they back off to a third-party tool that is hosted internally with us. Sometimes they have their own dedicated backend and database or nothing at all. But really, it's up to what your organization wants for the platform, and then try and build a journey around that.
It makes sense. The Q&A panel just exploded with tons of questions, but if we're going to go there, we probably won't get to what we plan to talk about. So, folks, I'm very sorry. We will get to as much questions as possible as our show progresses. Also, I'm 100% sure that a lot of those questions will be answered by the content that we are going to present. So hold tight. We will get to your questions, I promise. Take it from there.
Yeah, and one thing, right? This is the part that blew me away when talking to you, Lee. You're like, hey, there's 60 people working on Backstage, and it's open source, and you got 5 people working on the Backstage for Spotify. Yeah, somebody had to write a check for that, right?
yeah.
This the business part of my brain is like, how did that happen, right? You told me this story, and I just want to share it with you to share it with the community because I thought that was really interesting.
Sure. I mean, it's built off a couple of steps. At Spotify, we were really lucky because kind of Backstage grew organically internally before kind of we had to have the question around, hey, let's like more and more funding, if you will. The advantage that gave us was we already had some very, very early metrics around the impact Backstage had at Spotify itself. They were typically proxy metrics that we were using, but we already kind of had a little bit of an established, this is what can happen internally. The conversation we had to have was, of course, if we're going to open source this is going to take effort for us. So why should we do that? Why is that going to be beneficial? And that's kind of the hard part. So that part of the story started somewhere around November time, 2019. We open sourced in March of 2020, but between November and kind of March, there were a few things that happened. Firstly, one of our directors at the time, who was very, very closely aligned with Backstage, he was at, I think it was Google Cloud Next. And I can't remember the topic that he was there to talk about, etc. But following his talk, a bunch of execs from various different companies came along and basically said, hey, can you show us? Can you give us a little bit of a demo of what you were just talking about? And so being Spotify, to demo stuff, you go through Backstage. Like that's where we front end and surface all of our tooling. So he whips out his laptop, he opens it up, goes to Backstage. And I don't know if it's good or bad. It was great for Backstage, but the execs were more interested in, what's that? What's Backstage? Rather than, what was the thing that they actually came to ask about originally. And that was just because as he's going to this tool, he's clicking through and they're seeing all of these different kind of contexts, if you will. They're seeing services and all of the information around them. They're seeing the PagerDuty, the incident management right there. They're seeing documentation. So they were drawn more to Backstage. So he came back from that and said, hey, maybe there's something. We know it's been very beneficial. We've got some early metrics around it for Spotify. Maybe there's something out there outside of Spotify. Maybe we can make a dent. Maybe we can, gain some technical leadership in this domain, and while doing that, support a bunch of other organizations. So what followed then was we did the typical Spotify thing. We went and got data. We had a bunch of meetings with CNCF end users, with CNCF themselves, with other big open source project providers, just to kind of gauge what it means to be an open source and gauge the interest in Backstage itself. And I remember at the time I was living out in Sweden. I remember at the time it'd have been the last week of February, and the second to last or last week of February at Spotify, we do a hack week. And one thing that I'd set some of the teams going on was, if we want to open source this, can we demonstrate like we can put a version together of Backstage that can be open sourced during hack week? Just something dirty, quick and dirty. Like, just can we like de-Spotify it? Not everybody wants a playlist plugin. Not everybody needs it tied into all of our infrastructure. So we were spending a week doing this. And while this week was going on, I flew out to London to meet with some members of the CNCF talk, the leading group for CNCF. And I kind of came to him and said, hey, really excited. It looks like we're going to be open sourcing. I think we've got enough of a business case that we can say, other organizations are going to be interested. We're going to get all of this contribution from the open source community. There's going to be recruiting opportunities for us. It's going to be great. Really excited. Here's our plan. I've got like all the way out to November. We're going to launch it in November. It's going to be fantastic. And without putting words in mouth, and without swearing, effectively, it was, well, that's a silly idea, was the response that I got. And I kind of looked a little bit funny. And, well, why are you doing that? You're building something perfect to release it like 9 months down the road. Why don't you just release what you've got now, build it with the community? Like, get them engaged, give them a feeling of ownership, give them a feeling that you want to work together, and kind of do. Came back, mentioned this to this director, and he kind of looked at me and was like, yeah, that's a good idea. Well, it's March next week. How are you up for it? And that's kind of, we went for it. We spent a week literally putting some documentation together, putting a bit of a blog post together. We absolutely fumbled the blog post because as we launched it, we got a ton of response on GitHub and a ton of response on Hacker News. But generally the response on Hacker News was, why do I need it? What is it? Like 200 plugins? Why do I need that? That just sounds confusing. Like, no, not interested. So we learned a lot. But what we did do was started to gain an open source community pretty quickly. And with that open source community, the one I like to go to is within a couple of months of releasing out into the open source, I had a feature request for Backstage internal that had been open for years. And that was to add dark mode to the product, which sounds, frivolous. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a lot of work. But there's a lot going on in Backstage. So to make sure everybody, all the plugins align with it, etc., it was a lot of work. And it always got deprioritized. There was always something we should be doing that was more important. Couple of months into the open source community, we put out an RFC, a request for comment. And we put some Figma mock-ups of dark mode of Backstage in there. We put a bit of details in. Within 24 hours, we had a PR back from the community with dark mode, fully functioning. It was compatible with our internal system. This was a godsend for me. This was one of those moments where we accepted it. It was merged. We pulled it back up into the internal system. I could go and sit down with the VP and say, hey, this is the power of the community. We've been asking for this for months, for years and years and years, and never done it. And then all of a sudden, the power of this community, they're enthusiastic, they're keen. So that was one of like the key moments, if you will. Then of course we've done other things. We took part in Hacktoberfest with the community. We've run other community events. We've managed to recruit and bring people into Spotify from the community in a kind of pipeline in that way. And the product internally has grown and developed. So early on, we had some metrics. I think we've got them. We can look at them and run through them. And then there was also this moment of just people kind of contributing. That was like the soft power, if you will.
Yeah. And we got this one slide that you gave us, right? This was one of the earlier metrics that you used to kind of tell us about this.
So this, I think originally the idea for this came from Meta way back in the day. But again, going back to that hyper growth moment for Spotify, as we're bringing in more and more engineers and we're creating more and more services and more components that are all interconnected and so on, it gets more complex. And what we started to see was I don't know if confidence is the right word, but it became much harder for new joiners to Spotify to contribute, to kind of get their work into the Spotify music app and everything else that we were doing. So we'd heard that I think it was Meta had this metric, reduce time to the 10th pull request. So we took a look at it. And in the very, very early days of launching Backstage, in a form that you would recognize if you looked at it today, time to 10th pull request was at 66 days. It took 66
real quick
days.
For our audience, sorry to interrupt you, Lee. What does that mean? Time to 10th pull request?
Sure. So that is like the 10th contribution of code that an engineer could make to any project at Spotify. So every time you make a change in the code base, you submit what is called a pull request. That is basically a notification to the rest of your team saying, hey, I've made this change. Will you check it out? And if it's all good, it gets merged and shipped out to the product, if you will. So this is effectively going from a complete new joiner, never been at Spotify, first day kind of thing, all the way through to the 10th time that they did that. It was 66 days. It was over 2 months for them to be able to. We kind of went with 10th pull request as a proxy for like significant contribution. By that point, they're no longer like adding a comment to a document. They've probably made a significant change in one of our code bases.
And is that like one of the metrics that just folks at Spotify were measuring to use to measure developer productivity engineering, essentially?
Exactly. It was some of the early days of kind of like the developer productivity organization, if you will. And it was something that we didn't have hard metrics, but it was a proxy metric we could use to kind of say, hey, we're reducing the time or the complexity, et cetera, that it takes for an engineer to be able to do these things.
Got it. And how did you correlate that to Backstage? I mean, you could have just, well, hey guys, this is when Backstage started, but I'm sure you had a little bit more to kind of convince the executives or the leadership to write the check, as I would say, right?
For sure. Yeah. So this is there's this proxy metric which we reduced by 66%. There's also a series of other proxy metrics. I think we've got them on another slide where effectively we did some softer stuff, which was putting out internal surveys effectively, where it was. We were trying at the very early stages, we were trying to find what are the right metrics, and we weren't sure how best to track it. So we did things like internal surveys. So satisfaction, it was the tool that the teams were the most satisfied with out of all of the different internal tooling that we had. Contributions to Backstage by teams that were not those 5 engineers looking after it. And the number of plugins that we started to see pop up around stuff. So these were all kind of proxy metrics. Where it started to get a little bit harder was I think it was done over the course of 6 months. We started to look into like GHE activity and Backstage usage. And then we started to gather data around, like the amount of time people are spending in Backstage. What's the output in GHE? What's the output in actual deliveries out to production and things like that? That's when we started to get metrics where it made like there was no arguing. We could argue around the proxy metrics that this is the right thing. We should be investing in this. But when we started to get those harder metrics of actual being able to correlate Backstage usage to GHE usage.
And GHE, you're referring to
GitHub Enterprise. Sorry.
Yeah, that's
yeah. So it's again, we're going back to code. It's all about kind of like the production of code, if you will.
And basically, more Backstage usage ended up with developers writing and shipping more code. That's ultimately what you were able to prove with the data.
Yeah, it was off the top of my head, I think it was about 2 times more GHE, more GitHub activity for regular users of Backstage versus not. The cycle time, so the time it takes for starting an issue or starting a change all the way through to getting it through to production, that reduced by, I can't remember the numbers now, 15, 17%, something like that. And when you kind of combine those types of things, you can start to say fancy things. So you combining those, you can start to say, if you combined reduced cycle time with the increased number of pull request activity, you can start to say, oh, well, that actually saves us 3 full-time engineers out of every group of 10, if you will. So you can start to correlate all of this stuff and get those harder numbers to gain that extra buy-in and everything.
Awesome. Baruch, I'm sure the Q&A is just going nuts right now. We want to get to a demo and show some more metrics of what happened. Do we have anything interesting questions before we get into kind of more metrics and more wins?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions which are very relevant to what we just spoke about. And first is, with the explosion of plugins, how do the users struggle with just overwhelming amount of information? This is now it picked up and now it's overwhelming. How, I don't know if you planned for that, but how do you deal with that?
No, it's a good question. And it's one I get a lot whenever I speak to adopters. Often a question that I get is, I'll demo Spotify and it's like, oh, it's 200 plugins. It can do this, it can do that, it can make your breakfast. And often I'll get asked like, oh, well, how do we get that? And my response is always, you don't want it. What you want is just the right plugins, just the right setup to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And the magic of Backstage, if you will, for me is, I know we have 200 plus plugins. I look at 4 of them, usually, on average. And the reason is Backstage isn't laid out like, it's not a menu of different plugins. What happens is you will go to a context. So maybe you'll go and look at a service, and for that, as you're looking at the service, it will present you relevant plugins that service can take advantage of. So if I go and look at, say, for example, the Backstage service, I'll see down the side with plugins like CI/CD. It's relevant that I can go and look at CI/CD for the Backstage service. I will see Soundcheck. It's relevant for me to go and look at our test certification, things like that. So Backstage doesn't surface it all at once to you. You can totally go and search for it and find for it. But really, Backstage puts you in a place where you're in a context, and then it will surface the relevant information, the relevant plugins related to that context. So you don't get overwhelmed typically.
That makes sense. And just one more question, which I also find very interesting. If you had to name one plugin just that sells it to the majority of developers, like the exciter, what will it be?
One plugin to sell it to developers. Or
maybe change it around, because I had a similar question I was going to ask you, which is, what are the top 3 ones? Yep. I'm sure you guys have data internally. Yeah. Which are the ones used internally the most?
It can be top 3 that are used, or your personal top 3, the ones that are the most unorthodox, interesting, and you were like, wow, they use Backstage for that.
So the most used, so the number 1 plugin at Spotify is TechDocs. TechDocs is our docs-like code solution. And it's hooked up, I'll show you in the demo a little later, it's hooked up to all kinds of different useful bits of information. So you get the documentation, but you also get like related GitHub issues, you get Stack Overflow questions, you get things like that. By a very big margin, TechDocs is the main plugin that everybody uses. Following that, it would probably be CI/CD. So a lot of engineers will go in there and use it they make a change. They want to then follow that change through the journey, make sure everything is okay. And then I actually, off the top of my head, don't know what the third one is. My guess would be it's probably going to be something like PagerDuty. And the reason for that is not that we have lots of incidents. We probably do, but not more than what you would expect. But it's surfaced in many places. So we surface that widget, that plugin, sorry, in many places when you're looking at different services. Like, it's like a key piece of information that everybody should be aware of and should see. My personal top 3 are very different. I would go with probably Cost Insights. As an engineering manager, I'm very keen to see what I can do on that front. And then there's a very cool plugin that we don't use at Spotify, but it's been pretty relevant in my life. And I think we'll get to that towards the end of different ways of that people are using Backstage. I'll save that one for later.
Nice.
All right, now we are intrigued.
Yeah. And we have some more kind of metrics, just following up with that conversation, right? Of, other than the stuff that you talked about here, they're more active in GitHub, they get more code changes in, they deploy as faster, right? And we have kind of more there. Do you remember, like, was there, other than, we talked to develop productivity engineering teams, other than some of the usual stuff, what engineering leadership and whatnot care about as far as getting features into the hands of users as fast as possible, right? That's ultimately the name of the. Do you remember any notable wins? Any interesting, any stories you can tell?
So I can remember an interesting one from when it was quite early on when I started at Spotify. And that mostly relates to the one on the right there, the 5% more likely to be at Spotify 1 year later when they're using Backstage. Prior to being at Spotify, I used to work at Amazon, and obviously Amazon it's a big complex company. There's so many services, so many things going on. Amazon's not really known for the UX. They're not really known for the design of things. So as an Amazonian at the time, there were tons of tools that I would be using, but it would be like, pop open your terminal, write that command line argument in. It would be go to this random website, and it's, this website is a blank page with just blank with black monospace text on it and 2 buttons. It wasn't very cohesive, and it wasn't really thought about that it needed anything like that. When I joined at Spotify early on, there was this conversation around effectively treating engineers like engineers are humans too. We want to use tools that look nice. We want to use tools that are cohesive. And there was a very good conversation around cognitive load. And this idea of changing between different tools was actually causing cognitive load and was actually slowing people down. At the most basic level, remembering where a tool was. And then when you get there, how to use it. Where Backstage, I think, had like the secret sauce, if you will, internally, was we put a whole team of designers on it. We put people permanently there thinking about how it should look, how it can be cohesive. It's got to look nice. It's tools when you go to them, like plugins when you go to them, sorry. Okay, they have different functions, but you'll recognize the layouts. You'll recognize the patterns in where buttons are or how menus work and things like that. All in all, reducing that cognitive load. And it was a really good conversation from the fact of we were having that conversation. Like people were actually thinking, rather than just throwing up random tools into the terminal or throwing random tools up onto websites, how can we pull it all together? How can we make it look nice and make people want to come back to it? And out of when we onboard people, we do an engineering boot camp. It's a 1-week thing where people come together and they build a tool together. And they do it all through Backstage. And out of the feedback from that, it's always Backstage is like, why didn't we have this at our last organization? And repeated kind of sentiment across engineering through Spotify is we have this nice tool. Like the ideal place is you've got a terminal open, you've got your IDE, and you've got Backstage open. They're your 3 things to get anything done at Spotify. And Backstage takes away. It doesn't take away your choice, or it doesn't take away your choices. You can still do anything else. You don't have to use Backstage. You don't have to do things in that way. But it's going to be the most supported way, and it's going to reduce that cognitive load for you. It takes some of those layers off thinking that you don't have to be thinking about.
Well, it's a great story. And we have a little slide that and there's a nice Backstage. There's many blog posts from the Backstage team, but there's this kind of slide referring to exactly what you mentioned here. Tell us about kind of the Y and X axis here. Well, The y-axis is pretty easy, but what do you got on the x-axis here?
Yeah, so I mean the percentage retained over time, and what we saw again, this is looking at a cohort of like high usage Backstage users and low usage Backstage users. Low in blue, the high in, is it green? I want to say green, kind of thing. And again, it's just all we're trying to say is the retention, the percentage that we will retain over time remains at the end of the graph in more detail. If it had been on there, is about 5% difference of people will stay longer. They will last longer in their Spotify career before moving on to somewhere else.
Yeah. Developer productivity and developer happiness, right? And the whole developer experience. We talk about it all the time. We got around 15 minutes left. Lee, why don't you show us how folks at Spotify use Backstage? Give us like a 5-minute demo.
Sure. You'll have to keep me to 5 minutes. I get too excited when I do these things. So give me 1 second. And just let me share my screen. So what we're going to look at here, once it loads up, is basically I'm just going to take you through, this is Spotify's internal instance. So this is not something that we typically demo. We have demo instances set up from the open source. What we're looking at here is what every Spotify engineer gets to when they come in to Backstage at Spotify. Where we've landed, this is just the homepage. The homepage, we use it as a place effectively to do a couple of things. Give you quick access, so give you access to things that you regularly go to. Pull together all of the different services and tools. So someone earlier asked about all the different services and bits and pieces that we use at Spotify, and you can see a couple of them surfaced here. And we want to give you access to search. The whole point is how can we make it as quick as possible to get to the things that you want to get to. Down on the left here, I've pinned typical places that I go to. I'm just going to drop into one. So a little bit meta, but what we're looking at here is this is the Backstage front-end service running at Spotify, and we're looking at it through Backstage. So whenever you go and look at a service or a component, this is the screen that you'll get to first. This is our overview page. In the open source, we call it our entity page. And it just gives you relevant information. I was saying earlier about kind of staying in context. So on the right-hand side of this page is relevant information to this service. This menu in the middle here, where it's got overview, CI/CD, etc., these are plugins. So we have 200 and something plugins. We're surfacing a handful here relevant to the context that we're looking at. So in looking at this service, I can see quickly what the latest active deployment was. I can see ownership information and links around the service. So I can magically, I am still product manager and tech owner. That might need to change on Backstage over here. We're a Google house, so we got links out to the Google project and so on and so forth. I can see dependencies, how they're running, if there are any issues. I can see dependents. Down at the bottom here, PagerDuty, instantly I can see if there's any incidents, and I can jump in, again, relevant to the context where I am. If I want to look a little bit deeper, I can go across to CI/CD here, and this gives me all of the latest CI/CD information for Backstage. If I click on it, it gives me a high-level overview, and this is where I was saying we don't surface everything from every service that we're connected to. We surface the relevant stuff. If you want to go and look deeper, like if I click on here, it's going to take me straight into GitHub, and I can see exactly what was done in that side of things. And then I completely lost my window, I'm guessing. Yes, there we go. So that's CI/CD. I can do the same with tests if I want to go and look at that. Which are taking a minute to load.
Is this, while this loads, is when you're on your entry like homepage into Backstage, is there anything dynamic in there to say like, hey, your PR didn't pass or whatever? Is there or
at the top level? So at the moment, as dynamic as it gets, is you can choose the widgets that come up here. So for Spotify, we've chosen Stack Overflow, we've chosen the toolbox and quick access. I've seen instances where people have put PagerDuty. So the PagerDuty widget we saw on the front on the service page, I've seen people put that here. You can put different tech docs widgets. There's a handful of them. It's not as personalized as what we are aiming for. The vision is to make it personalized based on role and where you are in the organization and so on, but we're not quite there just yet. On at least
and one thing you mentioned earlier, you're like, hey, the ideal setup is, you got your IDE, you got Backstage, right? And we had one interesting question. It was like, well, how often are folks using it? Well, the master users, is this just is that kind of becoming the norm of, hey, I start my work day, whatever, I'm going to check once I finish checking email or whatever, and I'm ready to ready to actually get into my creative flow of writing code and working on my projects.
It's not the only tab. I would be lying if I said it was. Typically, I mean, I would imagine Spotify engineers tabs look very much like at other organizations. There's 15 or 20 of them. But Backstage very, very often now is a pinned tab. So whenever you're opening that browser up, there is Backstage. And typically the pages that people are kind of sitting on, they're sitting on the service page. So then they've got quick access into CI/CD, into tests, into various other bits and pieces. Or they typically sit on documentation on a specific topic. And the documentation, again, similarly to everything else.
This is what you're talking about is the most used plugin, right?
Exactly. This is the one. This is the one.
Yeah.
So the documentation, effectively, it's markdown files that sit in the repo right next to the code. So the idea is, you update the code, you update the docs, it's right there. Why wouldn't you? But what we find, so what we're looking at here is a golden path. This is what we use. There's many golden paths at Spotify. They're the recommended paths to build services at Spotify. So they're used by new starters, but more and more we're seeing people who have been at the company 5-10 years come back and reference what's the latest happenings, what's the latest updates around kind of services. And being in Backstage, I mean, the great thing is, as you go through the documentation, any links, any bits and pieces in here will deep link you through Backstage to a plugin to different areas. And that kind of power, the way that surfaces here, a lot of the time is in this panel over on the right, where what we can do is, if you're reading this documentation, let's say you say, oh, well, this link here, this is no longer correct. You can highlight it. And as you can see, I can open a GitHub issue straight away. Up on the top right, I can see 132 issues open for this document. Again, I can click into that. It'll give me all of those issues. I can deep dive in, and it's all about building trust. Trust that the documentation there is no longer stale. And trust that what I'm looking at is relevant. And we can do that across all the different environments, Stack Overflow, all of the different tools. I can click through this. It'll take me through to the Stack Overflow page, etc. So typically engineers would sit on service page like this, and then they can get to all of the different items. They might sit on data as well, or ML. The other common use case would be to create stuff. It's not as common. You're not always creating new software every single day. But this is the software templates, which is probably another important place where effectively it's it's like cookie cutter. That's really hard to say. Cookie cutter templates that allow you to, okay, I don't know what I clicked there, that allow you to spool up a new service and create infrastructure and so on and so forth around it. But this is the way of, like, we have the documentation that gives you the path. And then with these templates, you can engage with security to build in best practices. You can, with legal for like GDPR or ITGC requirements, and you can build in Spotify's way or your organization's way of building a service. So an engineer doesn't have to think about the plumbing necessarily. they can focus on solving the problem for their customers. So they're probably the common places. That's where typically people will come in and sit. And then as a manager, I usually end up on this page. I'm not going to go into cost insights for Spotify, but I will end up here because this gives me a overview. I can go and see all of the 13 different services that my teams own, all the different documentation. I can go and look at cost insights or security issues or metadata issues. So as an EM, this is where I'll end up typically.
Super cool. Thanks for showing us this demo. Baruch, we got like 5 minutes left. I want to just quickly jump into the most, some notable community users.
You go ahead. We have tons of questions. Obviously,
we could go over. Yeah, we could go over and just take some questions. Lee, real quick. I mean, I've seen all sorts of stuff on the Backstage LinkedIn. That's where I usually hang out to learn more about Backstage updates and whatnot. And I've seen everybody from U.S. Bank to American Airlines and folks that you wouldn't expect that would be that invested in developer productivity, developer experience, all in on Backstage. That was what really initially got me excited. And what are some interesting ones that you could talk about, some of their wins? I know it's got to be fairly quick because we're running out of time, but yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, there's a couple that springs to mind. Stash is one of them, I would say. So Stash is all about basically supporting people with like investing and pensions and things like that when they're not a little when people are not as sure how to do that type of thing. But Stash took Backstage. Oftentimes, when people deploy Backstage in their own organization, they'll give it a name. So Stash's name for Backstage is Elevate. And the interesting thing about Stash was effectively how they pulled everything together, particularly around health metrics. So they use DORA metrics. And if you're not sure what DORA metrics are, it's DevOps Research and Assessment metrics. They were looking at some specific things: deployment frequency, lead time for changes, mean time to restore, and change failure rate. And they hit a similar issue that Spotify had. They were growing in scale. They had many microservices kicking up everywhere. And typically, you would metric each service. But how do you get a holistic view over your entire setup? That's quite hard to do. So the team at Stash introduced some request tracing for all of the services, and they started to they combined a few things. They started to elevate, based on that, all of these DORA metrics from all of these different services to give you a health map of the entire organization. They combined that with PagerDuty to manage incidents and do incident management. So you had this central kind of place. They combined all of that with the software catalog to give you a list of all of the services and the ownership. So it kind of created this really nice central portal, central dashboard, if you will, where you could go and check not only the health of services, but who owns services. You could go and check the real-time incident information and if people needed support, etc. So it became a central place for effectively helping them to manage the health and longevity of all of the services that they've got. So it was just a really nice example in the engineering world of what you could do with Backstage and having that central developer portal.
That's awesome. And let's finish with that interesting story you were telling me about unusual, unusual related users.
Yeah. So I'm going to start the story with, I apologize, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the hospital. And I'm going to add that I am okay. So this is an incident where kind of Backstage and my real life crossed over, if you will. And it started with the team at Weaveworks. So Weaveworks are based out of London. They do some really, really awesome GitOps and various other things. And they were a very, very early contributor and very early adopter of Backstage. And one of the things they produced was Firecube COVID. So again, when we launched Backstage, it was right at the beginning of basically people starting to work from home and kind of COVID hitting a lot of different countries. And at the time, we didn't really know how to test for COVID. We didn't really know, we didn't have the vaccinations and so on and so forth. So what they did was, one of the things that doctors were doing were taking X-ray scans and then kind of manually evaluating them. Does it look like this person's got COVID? Firecube COVID effectively rolled out into hospitals, and it connected directly into the X-ray machines. So literally, as the doctor sent you down for an X-ray, they would take that X-ray. That information is instantly back with the doctor in Firecube COVID, and they run Firecube COVID runs it against a model of many, many, many different lung X-rays, and gives the doctor an instant indicator, likely to have COVID, likely not, so on and so forth. The funny story with this is where this comes into to play for me. Wasn't for COVID, but last year, unfortunately, I was a little bit ill for 6 or 8 months or something, and I got the pleasure of spending Christmas at the Royal London Hospital. And while I was in there, they sent me to the endoscopy department, which is the fantastic department where they put a big camera down your throat. I can highly recommend it for everybody. Some of the medicine they give you is fantastic, but it's not the most pleasant experience. And while I was in there, the doctor's trying to do bedside manner before we get going, and he was asking where I worked and so on and so forth. And in this room, it is literally, you're on an operating table, and there's a big machine, and it has this camera pipe thing, and they're preparing this. And then on the other side is all these computers and things and stations where the doctors can go and look at the results and things. And, where do you work? I work at Spotify, so on and so forth. And then he gave me some sedatives and bits and pieces and stuff. And then he says, we use a piece of Spotify software. And he swings round this monitor, and it is Firecube COVID. But instead of using it for the lung scans, they're using it for the pictures that they get from the camera. And unfortunately for me, they had to do it twice. But the fun thing was, the second time they're going for it, I'm looking at images in Backstage, my internals, if you will, from the first round. So it was just, that is not a use case that, like the COVID scanning, my experience was not a use case that we were thinking about when we open source Backstage. But to me, it's just wonderful, like the open source, what can happen in the open source. People can take it and do whatever they want with it effectively. And the fact that it's been able to help people, the fact that as a community lead and open source lead in Backstage, I got, like, it helped me effectively to get better, is just like, yeah, my mind was blown by that. So
a great way to kind of end it, right? You heard it here, folks. Backstage helped saved Lee's life. Lee indirectly saved his own life. He just didn't know it.
It's crazy.
A couple of I want to thank everybody. I want to show a couple of slides, and then we'll wrap it up with more Q&A. But Lee, thanks. This was great. Videos are going to be up for folks who want to share it with their folks. As far as stuff that we've done to give back to the open source world in the community, you can use a build scan. This is our free, developer experience UI thing that you can see what's happening in your build. Scans.gradle.com. It works for Gradle and Maven, and we have the Bazel one coming out soon. If you want to learn more about what we're doing with developer experience, we got this developer experience webcast. It's more like it's not really a training. It's kind of hands on. You can follow along with your build scan, but that's on August 24th. And finally, the Develop Productivity Engineering Summit. Lee's actually flying in to San Francisco to do a talk there as well, along with other folks from Uber and LinkedIn and Netflix and Square, Block and Slack and all the Meta and the usual folks. happy that we got some great sponsorship from Uber and Meta and Netflix and JetBrains to bring on this great event. That's all we got. We hope to see the next DevProd Eng Lowdown is with the Apollo folks, another well-known open source project, GraphQL, that you all may have heard of. That's the company behind it. And yeah, let's wrap up with some questions. We're way over, Baruch. I don't know, maybe pick 3 good ones if folks are still around. I don't know. We're way over time. I don't even know if anybody's here.
I think I have a couple of good ones, and one of them is really to throw you off and take the conversation to an entirely new direction, so I'll save it for last. But the first one, very on point, and I think important for a lot of folks. We all got excited. We all want to implement Backstage tomorrow in our organizations. What is the team composition and the skill set required to deploy, integrate, and maintain Backstage at my company?
So Backstage uses pretty standard technology. When we were open sourcing, we actually redid the back end, if you will, to align it better to more external and CNCF. So it's React.js front end, TypeScript. It's a Node.js back end for the service. You can back it off to a number of different DB types that you want, Postgres, etc., so on and so forth. The dynamic of the team at Spotify, so it's a team of 5 engineers. We are starting to split it out slightly, so we're moving to have a team that supports Backstage overall, and then we're splitting it out at the minute, the software catalog, to have a dedicated team on that. But that's mostly because we want to focus on it and drive it a bit more in the open source. But the 5 engineers, it's 5 engineers. We don't really specialize too much in front end, back end. We tend to work to full stack engineers, if you will. So the engineers themselves look after the infrastructure behind the project as well. That team does have a product manager who helps with kind of driving some of the initiatives internally, and an engineering manager, of course. The biggest recommendation I can have when it comes to that core team, the biggest challenge you're going to have is gaining adoption within your organization, is convincing other teams that this is a good idea and that they should adopt. Going back to the getting senior leadership on board and things like that, and the investment. So the one thing I would say is, for that team, you want a team that is very, very outgoing, that is very, very keen on networking, that is very keen to go out and do demos within the organization. You're going to have some times where you need to go and basically do a little bit of white glove service. You're going to sit down with some of the potential plugin owners and build with them. And then you're going to be evangelizing. So I would say skill sets, of course, it's more on the JavaScript side of things, React, TypeScript, Node, but focus, if you can, a little bit on that engagement model, and having a team that is willing and wanting to do that side of things.
That sounds very kind of down to earth, reasonable, and basically there is no reason not to do it. And just to mention, someone mentioned in the chat that there are already out there managed Backstage services that you can pay for someone else to do the hosting. So yeah, go ahead and check them out. One more question before the big one is oh yeah, no, I'm building it up because I think it's a great question. But one before that is, do you have a built-in infrastructure for testing plugins? Basically a pipeline for plugins creation.
So you not as much as what I would like, I'm going to say internally. It is relatively straightforward to spool up an instance of Backstage to test against. So a lot of, we haven't internally at Spotify felt the need to kind of go and build a dedicated testing platform or that side of things. And we tend to let teams spool up their own instance of Backstage to build a plugin in and test it before it graduates into the main environment. The downside of that is it's really a lot harder to test for if there's anything, like I make a change here and then something over there breaks in another plugin further down the line. So that's the gap that we've got. That is changing slowly. We are introducing different staged environments around the catalog and various other bits and pieces. But because it's like you can spool an instance up in a couple of lines in the command line. So because it was so easy to do that, we went for make that as easy as we possibly can to do it locally, allow them to test against it, etc., and then graduate. And that's just the path that it took as we were growing organically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And obviously there is always room for improvement. And if that's something that is on your mind, I'm sure that it will be much more seamless. And it's important to have the pipeline to give the plugin creators to have the certainty that what they are doing is solid, not breaking the confidence of moving forward. Exactly. Obviously. And the question that I wanted to ask, not directly related to Backstage, but very much related to developer productivity engineering and developer experience is, what do you think about the importance of golden path in general? What is your take on that? And since it is part of Backstage, what would be your recommendation in using this approach?
So golden paths are, I think, incredibly powerful when it comes to developer productivity. The way Spotify uses them, so Spotify really doesn't have any, if you talk about carrot and stick, Spotify really doesn't have any stick when it comes to that conversation. The way that Spotify uses the golden paths are very much, this is the recommended path, and if you go down this path, you will have the most tooling and most things to support you. So we encourage it. The golden paths on a practical level, I think they give they're a very good way of sharing knowledge that has been built up over years and years and years in a very clear and kind of welcoming way, particularly for new engineers into Spotify. They get to, like, new engineers coming into Spotify get to see all of these best practices that has had a lot of thought put into them by teams across the company. So I think they're a very powerful way to transfer knowledge. I think they're a very powerful way to be able to share that knowledge. I also think they're pretty empowering. So with the golden paths, what we do for ownership at Spotify is a golden path could be owned by a team. It could be owned by a guild, so a group of people across a number of teams. And that could be like a web guild, a backend guild, a mobile guild, etc. People who are the experts get to input into there. And then people who are across the company can use the GitHub method to get feedback in. The only thing I would say when it comes to a golden path thing is the same thing I say when people are adopting Backstage. Don't set out and try and build all of your golden paths at once if you are going to go down that route. Again, think about what is the problem, what is the challenge that it is that brought you to Backstage or another DPE platform. What are you trying to solve? And then try and verbalize that, if you will, or write it down into documentation and use that as your starting point for your golden path. So then you've got something that you can work towards. It's not too expansive. You are staying focused. People are more likely to engage that way.
Yeah. Lee, thanks again for joining us. I'll see you in person at the Develop Productivity Engineering Summit in September, unless I come to London earlier and get to catch up with you. Yeah, Baruch, thanks for managing and all the questions and taking care of all that. Great conversation, folks. Hope we can do it all over again soon. We'll see. So Gradle community, it's gradle.community.slack, right, Baruch? That's what it is.
exactly. That's the easiest way to get there. Gradle.community.slack, and I'm going to paste it in a second in the chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lee, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you for having me. Been great.